home as you might expect. In fact, there are many comparisons that can be drawn between both Cuba and Juneau. Both Cuba and Juneau are, in one way or another, isolated. They also rely heavily on tourism and can be viewed as an exotic other. Cuba, being an island with very limited trade, really is its own isolated community. Sure, some of Cuba's farmed goods, such as coffee and sugar, do get exported, but it is hard for things to get into Cuba. In fact, just as we may have a black market associated with Cuban cigars, they too have one. The Cuban black market, or bolsa negra as they call it, is bustling with consumer goods that are tough or expensive to find in stores. People, often overseas relatives of Cubans, bring goods into Cuba via airplane. These goods then get distributed to family members or are sold in markets held in alleyways and old shops throughout Cuba. One reason that trade is so limited is because of the US-Cuba embargo. Many of the Cubans we talked to thought the embargo should be lifted. The US embargo, enacted as official policy in 1962, shortly after Cuba nationalized the property of American citizens, has meant near total isolation from global trade goods, from not just the United States, but from countries doing business with the United States. Many Cubans don't understand the embargo, finding it hard to get unbiased information that fully answers their questions. However, it is clear that the embargo is the reason that Cubans wear black market clothes taken from sweatshops in Miami. And they actually prefer these bright and shiny garments to those made in Cuba, which are often of poorer quality. And I think it's worth noting that all of the student speakers here are wearing some kind of Cuban garment. Cuba's people are isolated too. It is very hard for Cubans to actually leave the island. They may only vacate if they marry a non-Cuban or if they are extremely well-to-do in their government. Now, just this last week, this policy shifted, but it was still in place when we were in Cuba, where we heard many stories like the one from a man I met in Las Terrazas, Yanqui, tales of far-off aunts in Venezuela and the possibility of escaping the island. But for almost all of them, it doesn't happen. And here's a picture of Annie in Las Terrazas. Now, our isolation here in Juneau obviously isn't as severe as that of the Cubans. However, being surrounded by mountains and water is very similar to living on an island. It can be hard and cumbersome to get things and people out of Juneau. Although Thank you. Although Cubans aren't able to leave the island, other people are able to enter it. Communism, erupting in 1959, essentially ended tourism. At that time, Fidel Castro's Cuban government focused on providing basic necessities to its people. Cubans no longer had to pay for healthcare, housing, or even education, and they still don't. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, however, the Cuban government has made a conscious decision to support their socialist principles with the profits made from foreign travelers. This boom in incoming traffic has made Cuba a hotspot for eco, heritage, and the possibility of mass tourism. Watching firsthand the effects of tourism in Cuba gave me flashbacks to Juneau in the summer. Locals promoting the most authentic parts of their livelihood, and tourists and travelers alike catching a glimpse of a different culture. There are little reminders of life before the embargo scattered throughout Cuba. When we arrived, one couldn't help but notice the 1950s-style cars roaming the streets. Many of these cars have been stripped of AC units, window levers, and even door handles. These relics have been relegated to scour the streets as taxis or retro remembrances of the past. While the cars all get fresh coats of paint on a regular basis, the rest of Cuba's infrastructure has been suffering in the past 20 years. Most notably, the buildings are in ill repair. In fact, one of my classmates had a building crumble into pieces just a few feet in front of her. The maintenance of these decaying cement buildings somewhat fell to the wayside due to Cuba's lack of monetary support. Antique fairs are also prevalent in large cities. They offer tourists a chance to reclaim a part of Cuba before the revolution. Cuba's rich history has made it an important destination for heritage tourists interested in its culture. Cuba can also be viewed as an exotic, or the exotic other it was in the 50s, a place where rich Americans could find leisure in such acts as gambling and prostitution. The power of tourism is evident by just how much money people working in the tourism industry make, as Andrea and Dominic have already stated. From one ride, taxi drivers can earn as much money as a nurse earns in a month. It is clear where money is to be had by Cubans, and it is in taxi drivers, casa owners, and restaurant owners. The main streets in large cities like Havana are teeming with Cuban merchandise. Seeing the ashtrays and Che shirts in Cuba reminded me of the gold pans and polar bear shirts of Juno. Tourism is integral to our community, much like tourism is to the Cubans. In Cuba, there are two types of people you'll come across: the jineteros, or people who will beg or swindle you for money, and the Cubano real, which translates to real Cuban. It took some getting used to, but once we were able to pick out the people in a crowd who were trying to scam us, the real Cuba appeared. A Cuba where you could ask anyone on the street for a direction, and they would go out of their way to help you. Of course, if you asked two Cubans, you'd probably get 3 different directions, but that's just Cuba for you. Saying that I only learned during the Cuba immersion trip would be a gross understatement. I grew. I grew from the seed of a student who had never internationally traveled into a deeply rooted redwood, or Sitka spruce. I grew into a better student, traveler, and man. On this trip, I was forced to confront the demon of the unknown. Going to a place that many Americans have mixed emotions about was the easy part. Actually confronting the language of Spanish, the poorness of a country, the dead cats on the sidewalk, forced me to think on my feet. The 4 classes taught in Cuba, Spanish, ecotourism, Hemingway Lit, and anthropology, are all subjects I would have had trouble learning in school. In Cuba, however, all these classes had context. I was able to not only read Spanish in a textbook, but hear Spanish spoken on the streets, read Spanish in newspaper headlines, and converse in Spanish with new friends. I was able to see firsthand the effects of tourism on a community so reliant on it, and I could see connections to my own community. I read Hemingway on the very island where he spent a third of his life, and visiting the houses, bars, and beaches he wrote about created great context. There were hundreds of different cultural values and anthropological ideas that filled my head in this place with such a profound history. Learning about class subjects was only a fraction of what I garnered from this trip. This trip has made me respect traveling, not only for the knowledge it can bring to someone, but for the courage it can draw out of someone. Cuba has been such a chance to grow. So yes, as a student, I learned about Spanish, ecotourism, Hemingway, and communism. As a person, I learned about respect, networking, trustworthiness, and humanity. I found it just as easy to learn from my teachers as I did from the man on the street selling peanuts. I learned that history will always have a profound effect on the present, just as the present will have repercussions in the future. The information gained from this trip will always be with me, stored in my digestive tract, the knots in my brain, the scars on my head. Cuba has shaped me permanently, and for that, I am forever grateful.
My name is Katie Bosler, and I am the Marketing and Public Relations Director here at the university. And this is when I just love my job, because this is just I'm so excited about this presentation tonight. But before I tell you more about that, I want to let you know about next week's presentation, which is also equally exciting. Ernestine Hayes, one of our professors of English and a American Book Award winner, is going to be giving a very interesting presentation right here at this time a week from tonight. It's called What Shall We Do with Our Histories? And Ernestine is going to examine the recent history of Lincoln Ani and ask listeners to consider that history from a perspective that is unfamiliar and perhaps even somewhat uncomfortable. Now, she gave this presentation at a Literature and the Environment conference here this past summer. It was an absolute brought down the house. So that's something you don't want to miss. And if you want more information about that, you can always go to uas.alaska.edu and look at our Evening at Egan schedule. Also, just give you a little bit of preview for November, the last 2 Evening at Egans on the 9th and I believe the 16th. We'll celebrate our One Campus, One Book. We will have a Gwich'in elder here on the 9th, and then the 16th will be the author and filmmaker, husband and wife of the book and film Being a Caribou. So that should be just fantastic. Now, on to tonight. You know, we are going to hear from 4 students, UAS students, and I believe at least 1 graduate, who went to Cuba. They spent the entire spring semester in Cuba with 4 faculty members, and they were part of a group of 12, most of these students from Juneau. Now, I asked myself, and I'll ask you, I mean, any other university can just say, hey, I think I want to go to Cuba for a semester, you know, with my colleagues, my academic colleagues, and some faculty, and learn about Hemingway, learn about tourism, learn about culture. What a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And we're going to hear some perspectives from this experience from these 4 students tonight and their professor, Kevin Maier. And so now I'm very proud to introduce my colleague and the coordinator of the Bachelor of English program here at the University of Alaska Southeast. He also is a specialist and teaches literature and the environment classes like nowhere else in the country. He is also a Hemingway scholar. Kevin Maier.
Glad to see that my students are arriving just on time at 5 after. Perfect, perfect. So thanks, Katie, for the nice introduction. I wanted to take a minute before we started to offer a couple of thanks. I see that none of them are actually here, but it's worth mentioning that the Chancellor, John Pugh, supported this whole entire program from the very beginning and was a big advocate for it, so he deserves some thanks. And yeah, exactly. We're not on. Perfect. Okay, good. Better? Okay. And then likewise, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Marcia Souza, and in particular her very helpful staff, Margaret Ray and Kim Stewart-Grenier, did a ton of legwork to make this very complicated trip a reality. So thanks are due to them as well. So as Katie mentioned, and as the title here suggests, we're here to talk about a semester-long immersion program. As you may already know, or as Katie said, 12 students, most of whom are sitting here in the front row, were in Cuba from February 1st to April 1st last spring. This is precisely the length of time that the Cuban government allows study abroad programs, or really any citizens that are not Cuban citizens, to stay in the country without a special visa. That's how long we were there. And as Katie also mentioned, 4 faculty members cycled in for intensive 3-week classes. That's the big picture. The class is focused, as Katie mentioned, also on Spanish, English, anthropology, and on humanities. And we've been thinking about how to present this, or how to capture the experience of spending 2 months in Cuba for a long time. For about 3 months now, we've been emailing back and forth, having conversations with people about what can we do? How can we do justice to this experience? And what kept coming back to me as we were trying to do this was what one of my students wrote in his end of the term journal. He said, it would take a full 2 months to explain the 2-month experience. Clearly we don't have 2 months tonight. So I thought I might start. Miles is ready. He's ready to stay for a full 2 months again. But I thought we might start by just reducing the trip to a series of data points. So with apologies to the Harper's Index, this is Cuba by the numbers. And I'm gonna try and frame it in response to the frequently asked questions, at least the ones that I've been asked. Awesome. So what lots of people want to know is, who are the students? Well, they came from various degree programs ranging from English to social science. 10 of them are from Juneau, or graduated from a Juneau high school. And for 3 of the students involved in the program, the trip represented their first experience traveling abroad. So it was time to get a passport, that sort of thing. Everybody wants to know if we got to ride in cool old American cars. And we most certainly did. We got to ride in a whole range of kind of interesting vehicles, from bike taxis to really cool 50s Chevys, and from horse-drawn carriages to air-conditioned buses. one of those bus rides we'd like to forget. Everybody wants to know where we stayed. We stayed at government-authorized Casa Particulares. These are rooms in family homes that are rented for tourists. Sometimes they're as cheap as $8 a night per person. On average, we paid about $12. Everybody also wants to know how the food was, and of course, it was really, really good at times and really marginal at times. And we found ourselves interestingly enough, eating an enormous number of these individual pizzas that you could buy on the street for about $0.25. And there are nice restaurants, and we did get good food in the casas, but to go to the restaurants, you have to participate in the tourist economy. And in Cuba, one interesting thing that we found is that there are, in fact, two currencies. There's a local peso and a convertible peso. The latter is tied directly to the value of the US dollar. And so if you're participating in this kind of tourist economy, everything was really expensive. To go to restaurants was 8 to 10, kind of Juno prices to eat out. So we found ourselves eating on the street quite frequently. And a lot of these pizzas. People wanted to know where we went. Well, we spent a lot of time in Havana. The students spent considerable time in about 10 cities. These included Playa Girón, Santa Clara, Cienfuegos, Trinidad, Vinales, Cojimar, Morón, and Remedios. But again, we kind of kept coming back through Havana and moving Havana as the hub. And last, everybody wants to know how the Cuban people were, and I think this is where it gets difficult to reduce this to a number or to a statistic, right? In general, the Cuban people we interacted with were awesome. They were warm, they were welcoming, they helped us. And really, really excited about the fact that we were from Alaska, and wanted, for the most part, to get to know more about us. Some of them excessively so. We'll hear more about this shortly, but I think that what you'll see here is that these data points don't really do justice to the experience, right? We thought, oh, well, maybe what we should do is we should make a Google Earth map and we'll fly in the flight mode and see in 3D representation all the places we went, and we made it, and it was just kind of boring and it didn't really work. So we thought instead, this is my humanities perspective kind of shining through here, what you really wanted to hear were the individual experiences. So as Katie mentioned, I'm a Hemingway scholar. I write and publish about Hemingway. I go to Hemingway Society meetings, and I know that means different things to different people, and sometimes I'm uncomfortable with it, but I happen to know a whole lot about Hemingway. As you'll see in the picture right there, that's Hemingway and Fidel Castro. This is the only moment that they met. It was in 1960. Castro had just come to power, as we know, and had just entered for the first time a big game fishing contest, one that Hemingway had coordinated starting in 1950. And not surprisingly, Castro won the fishing contest here. But as a Hemingway scholar, it was a rare privilege to travel to the country where the famous author spent the last third of his life, visiting sites few American scholars have really seen. Given the Cuban Revolution that brought Castro to power in 1959 and the American embargo that followed shortly thereafter, I had fantasies that the country would look very much like it did in Hemingway's day. I knew that this was a key draw for travelers and tourists alike. I also knew that it would be more complicated than this, partly because I was in the middle of writing a paper about Hemingway's travel ethos. So in this paper, I read Hemingway's 1930 essays published in Esquire magazine to argue that the author did much to shape the definitions of authentic travel. He does this, I argue, by presenting a sharp distinction between what we might call the traveler's ethos on the one hand and the tourist ethos on the other. But he also simultaneously blurs the distinctions by writing about how we ought to get off the beaten path for an audience that at the time, Esquire magazine was founded in the 1930s, had a circulation of 1 million people. So he's reaching this mass audience, telling us that we should live the kind of high lifestyle like the expatriate Paris artist that we knew him from previously. And there's a kind of inherent contradiction there, right? You can't tell everybody to go to the hot new hotel or the hot new cafe down the street without that hotel or cafe turning into the place where everybody goes who's a tourist, right? And so for me, this represented, I can say more about this argument later, but this was for me from the faculty perspective, one of those paradigmatic moments where my teaching and my research came together, right? Like this is what we're always kind of striving for here at the university. But what I couldn't really have imagined prior to leaving was how fascinating it would be to visit the Cuban places that were engaged in selling an image of Hemingway, the traveler, that is the connoisseur of the finer things in life, to an increasingly mass tourism-oriented audience. So the numbers of tourists visiting Cuba has skyrocketed in the last 2 decades, from about 300,000 visitors in 1990 to 2.7 million in 2011, and it's projected to be upwards of 3 million by 2013. Those of us who live in this kind of tourism economy here know that what 1 million people looks like, right? So we have a sense for that. The reason for that upshot is a very interesting political history. Prior to 1990, Cubans relied on an importation of oil and of resources from the former Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union falls, the subsidies are gone, and the Cuban government, Castro's government, decides that they will use they will use tourism rather to sort of prop up the ideals of the socialist revolution. There's an interesting history there. But what happens is that many of these visitors come looking for Hemingway, and Cuba is increasingly ready for them. So, for instance, this is the Finca Vigía, which roughly translates as the lookout farm. It's the estate outside of Havana that Hemingway bought with his third wife, Martha Gellhorn, in 1940. On the left is an image of Hemingway standing beneath a portrait that the American painter Waldo Pierce did of him. I ask that you note the peeling ceiling paint above his head there. In the upper right, we see Hemingway having dinner with his fourth wife, Mary Welsh. Note the taxidermy on every available flat surface. And on the bottom right is an image of some Cuban kids who played baseball on the grounds of the finca. And Hemingway actually organized them into a formal team to play with his own children, bought them equipment, drove them around to games, and that sort of thing. So Castro turned the Finca Vigía into the Museo Hemingway. As the director told us, and as the Hemingway scholars in Cuba actually reminded us, is it was a museum for the people. And it has been preserved almost exactly as Hemingway left it. In fact, it's probably in better shape now than it was in Hemingway's day. So note the freshly whitewashed exterior walls. Note the carefully preserved taxidermy, right? Not an easy thing to do in this tropical climate. Note that the table is still set. The magazine rack is still full in that upper right-hand image. And the liquor bottles are all still there, right? It looks as if Hemingway has just gone out back, or has left the building, even though it's been a full 50 years since he died. So through a connection in the Hemingway Society, I was able to coordinate a tour with 2 of the kids on the previous slide who grew up playing baseball on the grounds. In the lower 2 images, we see Oscar Blas and Oscar Villarreal, both of whom are in their 80s now. And they offered us this really lively 3-hour tour of the grounds through their unique perspective. Both wanted to defend Hemingway's honor as a great man, clearly working against this recent tradition to rewrite Hemingway's biography as the great womanizer or the alcoholic or any number of bizarre sexual fetishes that Hemingway had late in life. There aren't too many people alive who knew Hemingway in this way, right? And so this was a really rare opportunity. If they had been at a Hemingway Society meeting, they would have been the keynote speakers. But here we were getting this 3-hour tour from these guys that had grown up living around Hemingway. Pretty spectacular for me. There were some other interesting moments. We got to see Hemingway's beloved fishing boat, the Pilar, which is now on the grounds of the finca as well. It's on a former tennis court. It's been restored to better than original conditions with the help of an American team. Bob Villa, in particular, has gone over there a number of times and consulted, and they've repaired it. I thought this might be interesting. There's a recent biography that came out that's entitled Hemingway's Boat. I had just read it, so it was fun for me to actually see the boat and think about Hemingway spending time on it. We also got to visit Kogiman, the setting for Hemingway's famous 1952 novella, The Old Man and the Sea. And I think that it's really fair to say that the way that I read that novel will now forever be changed by the discussions that we had about the novel, reading about landscapes that were described as we were sitting there having these conversations. So we got to visit some of Hemingway's favorite Havana haunts, and all of which appear in his writing about Cuba that we were discussing as a class. So our day-to-day life, we had class every single day, and we would typically get up, have a conversation about one of the books that we had read or about the biography that we were looking at. And then in the afternoon, we would go to sites that were significant either for the book itself or for Hemingway. So, for example, we read To Have and Have Not, Hemingway's 1930s proletariat novel, and visited the Ambos Mundos Hotel in Havana that was described in the novel. But we not only saw the hotel's carefully preserved 1930s Art Deco architecture and decor, but we visited the room where Hemingway wrote parts of it. The room had been turned into a museum. This trend is kind of an interesting one. So any effort to track Hemingway's through the streets of Havana would be incomplete without a stop at the Floridita and the Bogadita del Medio. Both these bars feature prominently in the mythology about Hemingway's famous drinking, right? As well as in his posthumously published novel, Islands in the Stream, that we were discussing as a class. Both these bars now cash in on Hemingway's famous image. That handwritten note with Hemingway's signature on it is on the wall of the Bogadita del Medio. I'm not sure if you can read what it says there, but it says, my mojito in la Bogadita, my daiquiri in El Floridita. So, at the Floridita now, you'll see, as in the lower image on the left-hand corner, Ellie's posing with Hemingway there. She gave me permission to put this picture up, right? There's a full-size, life-size statue of Hemingway sitting at the bar that's been preserved almost exactly as it was in the 1940s and 1950s. And behind Ellie, you'll see also that same picture of Hemingway and Castro for the fishing contest. And just in case the full-size statue wasn't enough, there's an additional bust of Hemingway there, right? So these bars, the Bogaditas in the upper right-hand corner, are now, they've been preserved and they're being sold as mass tourism destinations. These are the very places that Hemingway was writing in Esquire in his travel letters saying, go check them out, these are the hot places to go. Now you get a string of tourists, many of them German, like the fellow in the lower right-hand corner there, who get off a bus tour, walk in, get a kind of description of what happened here. Hemingway's drinking record of 12, I think it is, daiquiris or something. 13, okay, yeah. Double daiquiris. And then you walk in a streaming line and get your picture snapped with the statue and you walk out, right? So the bars are really cashing in on Hemingway's image. And I think this is really striking in a country that's obviously devoid of corporate iconography and logos. Hemingway's visage just became a key part of how tourism marketed itself. So ultimately, these tourist destinations dedicated to Hemingway provided great on-the-ground confirmation and some complications, too, to the argument that I was making in that essay. And they also provided some really great teaching moments, right? How could we read Hemingway without absorbing some of the larger-than-life aspects of his public image? This is a harder thing to do in a classroom in Juneau, right? People that are born in 1990 don't have a sense of the celebrity that surrounded Hemingway in the 1940s and the 1950s, and it's hard to recreate. But when you see it every day, it just becomes part of you thinking, oh yeah, he was a celebrity, this is really what's going on here. So it was easier to ask these central questions. So for instance, Hemingway scholarship today is really interested in how does this public image necessarily precede and inform the way that we read the novels? I could ask my own research question of, how does Hemingway's notions of appropriate travel inform how we're interacting with these places and people? As you can tell, and as my students are going to say here, I could go on and on and on about Hemingway for the rest of the night, right? And I don't really want to do that. So as we were trying to decide how to frame this presentation, we thought, well, we could have Claudia Wakefield stand up and tell a story about Cuban accents. We could have Dan Monteith offer an anthropological account of changing cultural values in Cuba. We could have my colleague Forrest Wagner, the director of our Outdoor Studies program, talk about tourism and place-based education. But ultimately, we decided that the presentation should highlight some of UAS's greatest assets, students. The decision, unfortunately, didn't solve all of our problems because we didn't want to have 12 students stand up here and take the full 2 months that we were talking about earlier. So we practiced this consensus process while we were in country, and we used it to choose 4 representative speakers tonight. And this consensus process, I want to pause and talk about it for a second, because I think it's what really sets our program apart from other programs. I mean, not only was it fairly remarkable to be there for a full semester, but we collectively made decisions about where to go, where to eat, where to sleep, what to do. And we found out that this is really hard, right? This created a lot of heartache and a lot of headaches. But it also meant that we had a much different interaction with the country than we would have if I had just dictated, we're going to go here, and we're going to go here, and we're going to go there, right? In fact, we ran into 3 or 4 other programs, most of them from fairly expensive private liberal arts colleges, that were doing just this, right? They were on a canned tour where they would stay at the 5-star hotel, they would eat at the fancy restaurant, and be drug around to the various sites, and then take it home. I think that what we're going to get here, as you're going to see from these student presentations, is a much different experience and a much, I think, richer experience. So at this point, I'll introduce the 4 speakers and just get out of the way. So first, we're going to hear from Ellie Sika, a lifelong Alaskan. Ellie graduated from UAS with her bachelor's in social science last spring. And Ellie will outline some of the preconceptions we had about the country before we left. And then after Ellie, I've asked each of the next 3 speakers, again, all lifelong residents of Juneau, to focus on the question of what we learned, and in particular what we learned in Cuba that we couldn't have learned in a traditional classroom setting. So after Ellie, we'll hear from Andrea Budville, an English major. Andrea will graduate this spring with an emphasis in creative writing. She's going to tell us the story of a few of the amazing people we met in Cuba. I don't think there were any marriage proposals. No. Maybe. Okay. Next, Dominic Lodovici, another English major planning to graduate this spring, will offer a general overview of the political differences between Cuba and the United States. And finally, we'll hear from Lars Johnson here, who I learned just declared an art major, is that true? And he'll offer a more personal reflection on the experience of traveling abroad for the first time. So a word about the form. At the end, I'm going to ask all the students who went on the trip and the faculty members who are here to come up, and we'll have some time for question and answer at the end. So I ask that you hold your questions to the end. And we'll also have a microphone to go around. This is being recorded and streamed live. So we'll need to wait until the microphone comes to ask questions. But from here, we'll just sort of, we'll cycle through, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. So Ellie Sika.
All right. Hola. Cigars, rum, mojitos, music, salsa dancing, dominoes, old cars, baseball, and communism. Where else but the island of Cuba? When most people think of Cuba, many of these images come to mind, but how much is authentic and how much is myth? Before traveling to Cuba, each one of us was given the task to write down our preconceptions, which might later reveal themselves as misconceptions. I'm going to outline my own preconceptions as well as some of our group's collective preconceptions, briefly explain how they were confirmed or complicated by our experience in Cuba, and conclude how immersion into the Cuban lifestyle was beneficial to our education and lives. Due to the US-Cuba embargo blockade, we are barred from spending money within the island nation, and therefore this makes travel near impossible for Americans unless government approval has been given. Because of relations like this, many of us were ignorant of Cuban culture, politics, and changing social attitudes. The Elian Gonzalez custody dispute of 1999 was a symbol of tense relations between our 2 neighboring countries, and discussions of lifting the Cuban embargo is usually thwarted by the vocal Cuban exile population within the United States. Movies like Dirty Dancing, Havana Nights, and The Motorcycle Diaries were some of our sources of Cuban culture as teenagers, which personally fed into my desire to explore the off-limits country. Romantic ideals of communism and discussions about socialism have been tossed around here and there within our society that is frustrated with corporate rule, especially within the Occupy Wall Street movement. For many reasons, Cuba is a society ripe for study because it is like none other, while still being heavily affected by a changing globalized society economically, politically, and socially. Many of us expected Cuba to be a society stuck in time, specifically the 1940s and 1950s, where old American cars line the streets and people of humble means wear simple clothing and take pleasure in salsa, cigars, and dominoes. We expected the Cuban people to be friendly but reserved while discussing politics and sentiments regarding Fidel, Che, and communism. Another assumption was that Cuba was an atheist country due to its communist history, where there would be tense attitudes regarding religious practice. We were unsure if it was possible to gather in large groups on the street or hang out with Cuban peers at night due to conflicting messages on laws about groups assembling in public. It was also assumed that Cubans would not like Americans, and that we would be walking on eggshells while getting to know our Cuban families, due to our tense political and economic relations, as well as our shared history. However, we also expected to see a more egalitarian society where everyone is equal in status and availability to higher education and healthcare. It was also unclear as to how Cubans would react to social issues regarding race, gender, and sexual orientation. Would it present itself a more progressive society because of its efforts to legally equalize everyone? Or would it present itself in a more traditional Latin American fashion where Spanish Catholic roots and machismo culture are alive and well? While reading articles and books on the subjects were enlightening, we believed that our preconceptions and questions could only be answered by traveling and living within the country, meeting the people, speaking the language, and therefore trying to become primary resources on the issues that sparked our interest. Our preconceptions continued to grow even after entering Cuba, and some were met in ways we never expected. The concrete low ceilings and flickering bad lights of the airport made it feel like a true Soviet bloc welcome. The endless clouds of cigarette and cigar smoke within and outside buildings, painted propaganda murals, and vintage vehicles filled our Havana nights-inspired visions of the country. As soon as we left the plane, a Soviet-made classic itself, and made our way through customs, it was obvious that we were a big group of foreigners. We were immediately questioned as to why we were there and what our business was. As an American citizen entering into a virtually off-limits country, I immediately started thinking to myself, what did I get myself into? But just as suddenly as we were approached, we were left alone to carry on with our business. A prime example of Cuban interactions. Now this slide, you'll see two different pictures. The one on top is a lot of us gathered with our family in Playa Huron, or Bay of Pigs, and we had a celebration that night, our last night in town. And then on the bottom right is my family in Vignales, and this was my birthday, and they presented me with a birthday cake from a store, which is one of the highest honors you can get from a family. One of the most interesting revelations is that religion is making a comeback in the country. Walking on the Cuban streets, you can walk by or join in a Santeria ceremony, which happens to happen quite loudly and frequently, actually. Near the end of our trip, we were able to attend Mass with Pope Benedict in Revolutionary Square, which in our minds was a very thoughtful and strategic location. At the end of the Mass, the Pope was greeted by President Raul Castro, Fidel's brother and successor, and the two shook hands briefly and paused for photographs before Castro descended down the stairs and disappeared. In this slide, you're going to see those two photos. On the upper corner, you can see after they had shaken hands. And then in the bottom right corner, you can see the crowd receiving communion. That was right in front of us. Who would have thought beforehand that anything like this would be possible, especially in Cuba? A place that once had banned Christmas was now experiencing its first Holy Week since the revolution. Cuba continued to surprise us with evolving and progressing responses to social issues like gay rights. Raul Castro's daughter, Mariela Castro Espin, is the head of the National Center for Sex Education and helped organize Cuba's first annual National Day Against Homophobia. Mariela is the lead advocate of gay rights in Cuba, including her support of same-sex marriage. This is an amazing change from Cuba's old policies regarding homosexuality, which included jailing individuals who appeared effeminate or stating that homosexuals were counter-revolution because they challenged Che's new man communist ideal. This is a photo of a Cuban youth here, and it says Jóvenes Cubanos del Papa, means Cuban youth of the Pope. If we learned anything in the country, we learned that the island of Cuba is changing dramatically, which can prove to be both sad and joyous. No matter the outcome, Cubans are immensely proud of their country's unique culture. The Cuban people have a neighborly network that spans the entire island, and this is done without reliable access to internet. This communication is done via phone and seems to be one of the main reasons why the island is connected so personally. This neighborly attitude extends to the streets, where people are always willing to help you with directions or even walk you to your destination, but always be mindful of jineteros, or hustlers, who will want to be paid for their service or marry you in order to exit the country. Many Americans who feel frustrated with impersonal internet communication and social media may look at this form of communication with nostalgia, but most Cubans, especially the youth, want internet. In Cuba, the internet is still very limited and controlled. If you wanted to use the internet, you would have to find a high-end hotel or phone company where you would then wait in line, buy an internet card, and succumb to the incredibly slow Cuban internet connection. No matter the speed or availability, many young Cubans believe that the internet is an agent of change in the country. Andrea will later introduce us to Duviel and talk about his story. Recently, I saw on his Facebook page a status that read, "Cuba is changing." So this made me want to go online and search for Cuban news, and I found that the country will end its requirement for exit visas, which will possibly allow average Cubans to travel or leave the country with just a passport and a visa for the country that they're traveling to. However, there are other policies within this that make traveling harder for medical professionals and other professionally trained Cubans in order to keep them in the country practicing. Only time will tell how this policy will play out in practice and reveal whether or not this is a political stunt in order to show that the Castro administration is more progressive and open. Right now, it is a joyous event for many, and the chance to leave the island and explore the world, if they have the funds to do so, is something that many Cubans have yearned for. As I mentioned before, there could have been no other way to glean this sort of information without being fully immersed within the culture. Within the period of 2 months, we were given so many more opportunities than if it were just a couple weeks, including things such as enjoying desserts that Cubans prepare for Valentine's Day, or the several birthdays we celebrated with our families, swimming in the Bay of Pigs, or Playa Huron, attending Cuban baseball games in both local and professional stadiums, meeting elderly Cuban men who had grown up as children on Ernest Hemingway's Havana estate playing baseball with his children, taking part in the Love and Peace Festival and reggaeton concerts, witnessing Santeria ceremonies, and to end it all by participating in Mass with the Pope. No matter how emotional or unknown the trip was at first, we were able to witness history in the making.
Okay, so our group of students and professors stayed in what are called casas particulares when we were in Cuba. These are houses people own and usually live in with a room or two to rent out to travelers. These houses were government approved and indicated by the sign. It looks sort of like a blue upside down anchor. We stayed in many different casas. The picture all the way on the right is, or sorry, your left, that's Dominic and Lars in our house in Playa Huron. The one in the middle, that is one of our houses we stayed in Trinidad. And the other one is one of our meals that was prepared for us in Viñales. Because of the family living so close to us and usually cooking for us, we got to know the owners fairly well. Sometimes we had to communicate only in Spanish, sometimes in a mixture of English and Spanish. Cubans are very open to talking about anything, which was a big surprise to us. I'm going to share the stories of 3 Cuban people who we met through the casas. Maria, a 60-something-year-old woman who lives in the Bay of Pigs area, she is still pro-revolution and a big supporter of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Duviel, a young Cuban who gave us a clear perspective from Cubans in our own generation and offered first-hand evidence of the loopholes that Cubans seek when wanting to leave the country. Then there's Rolando and his hostel, which was our home away from home in Havana. Rolando provided us with a lot of valuable information for traveling with ease around Cuba. These people's stories really stuck with me because of how differently each person viewed Cuba. During the early portion of our trip, we stayed in Playa Girón and met a woman named Maria. She's all the way on the left there in the pinkish shirt. For one of our class sessions, she joined us and spoke to us, all in Spanish, about her life story. Maria was very young during the revolution, and she described how her family was really poor before the revolution, and her father was actually the person in the Bay of Pigs area to raise the rebel flag. After this, Batista's soldiers searched for him for 15 days, but he ended up avoiding them. So she went on to explain just how much better her quality of life was for her and her family after the revolution. One highlight was that they could give each other small gifts once in a while. Maria gave all the credit for her better life to Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. In fact, she made the statement that Fidel was the best president Cuba could have had, and she also cried when talking about how great of a man Che was. At this point, she held up a keychain with his face on it. I didn't have a picture of the keychain, but the photo on your right bottom corner is a picture of Che's face in a cappuccino that one of the students received. This was really common. Also, the top right corner, that was the cake that in that earlier photo that Ellie showed with all of us in Playa Girón, that was the cake that they gave us on Valentine's Day. So, I remember realizing in this moment just how recent the revolution was and how there are people whose lives have really been improved because of it. Maria also addressed some of the negatives of living in post-revolution Cuba. The worst issue for her is that Cubans cannot leave the country. Her children all live in Miami, and she hasn't been able to see them in years. We're not sure how they got to Miami, but they've written letters requesting permission for her to visit, and the government has shut them down every time. When she was saying this, Maria started crying again because she does not even have the option of seeing her children because of her government. Even though my Spanish was limited and my ability to relate to her story was basically non-existent, I couldn't help but tear up too. Maria now works with her friend at a casa particulare. She meets travelers like us all the time, cooks for them, and maybe even shares her story. Our group bonded with Maria and her friends really well, which I think is one of the reasons they threw us a party. Many people we met in Maria's generation shared similar thoughts on the revolution and the Cuban government. We noticed a big difference in the opinion of the next generation of Cuba. We visited many places during our 2 months in Cuba, and for a lot of us, Viñales was our favorite spot. We stayed here the longest, a total of 9 days, split up between a few casas. I was lucky enough to stay in a home with a family who has been running their casa particulare for 12 years. The owners, Jorge, Sarah, and their sons, Jorgito, who's 19 years old, and Duviel, who I think is about 25. Duviel spoke English and really showed us a lot of the Viñales area. We eventually pieced together his story through many different conversations. He grew up in Viñales, went to art school, and eventually married a woman from Sweden. Because of her, he was able to move to Sweden, where he learned the language, worked there, and obtained citizenship. Until last week, Cubans were not allowed to leave the country. One of the only ways out was to marry someone from another country. This is why we have so many marriage proposals. Many young people like Duviel take this opportunity to get out of Cuba. We never found out for sure if he actually married for love or for opportunity, but either way, he ended up getting divorced after a few years in Sweden and had just recently returned to Cuba when we met him. He now saw Cuba differently. He spoke 3 languages, Spanish, Swedish, and English, he had dual citizenship, and he had had access to information and experiences the majority of Cubans really would never have. Dubiel expressed a lot of discontent living in Cuba after seeing the outside world. He told us about how his generation wants a lot to change in Cuba's policy. More internet access, lifting travel restrictions, allowing Cubans to gain knowledge and experience the world. With all his discontents, he still expressed a lot of pride in being Cuban and was very patriotic. We found this to be really common in the younger generation. As Ellie mentioned, most of us had never been to a place with such limited internet access. It was interesting to experience a break from technology, and then to realize that our lack of technology was at a level that still most Cubans would never even get to. There isn't a lot of current information about Cuba on the internet these days, which made planning our semester really difficult. None of us knew what to expect, and I personally was pretty nervous before arrival about finding a place to stay. Luckily, one of the students, Alex Botello, was able to find one hostel online called Rolando's Backpacker, and we booked it for all 13 of us for our first few nights in Havana. The owner of this hostel was a huge part of our entire Cuban experience. Rolando greeted us at 3 o'clock in the morning in front of his hostel. He quickly got us into bed so that we could all sleep well on our first night in Cuba. The next day started with fried eggs and delicious yellow bread. Rolando showed us on a map where we were and how to get to the main areas in Havana. That's him in the red shirt over there. He warned us about how our group would draw attention, not to buy cigars in the streets from jineteros, and to keep our purses at home when it was dark. Every time we returned to Havana during our 2 months, which was at least 5 times, most of us stayed at Rolando's. Each time we got to know a little bit more about him and about his family. Also, each time we saw changes to his hostel, like the addition of new bunk beds. Rolando used to be his surgeon, and his wife used to be a dentist. They have 2 kids. In the United States, we could assume that with these professions, they would be pretty wealthy. But the couple gave up their careers to cater to tourists. It took me a while to understand why somebody would choose to make that career change. In Cuba, there is an unexpected class division between the everyday person and the people that work in the tourism industry. The wealthier people are the ones who work in tourist resort restaurants, drive taxis, or own a casa particulare. Rolando and his family spend all day, every day, making reservations, cooking, cleaning, and helping tourists. In the United States, it would be strange to find such educated people working in a field that most wouldn't consider a ticket to success. This is part of an uprising of opportunities for Cubans to capitalize on the tourist economy. In one of the many conversations with Rolando, he claimed that communism is dead in Cuba. People still believe in the socialist ideas, but there is evidence of capitalism slowly but surely making its way into Cuban lives. Rolando's hostel was different from all the other places we stayed, mostly because he housed so many people, which made him more money and allowed him to employ a few people and make improvements. One of these people was our favorite bartender named Leo. He's in the top right corner with one of the students, Gloria. Another occasion which we received a cake for Gloria's birthday. Leo worked at Rolando's every evening in the open-air patio, serving dinner and drinks to tourists. He was a chemical engineer before going back to school to study hotel, restaurant, and tourism management. Leo is another example of a successful, educated Cuban who gave up his career to make more money serving tourists. Rolando's hostel was our home away from home for the 2 months we spent in Cuba. We were quickly attached to his home and his family. Our conversations were always interesting, and in a few different languages, of course. Rolando is a great example of a modern Cuban who appreciates the Cuban government but is taking advantage of the opportunities in capitalism that are presenting themselves to the people of Cuba. All 12 students spent the entire 2 months in Cuba, bouncing from town to town, casa to casa, and it was very exhausting. We found comfort in conversing with our casa owners and valued the information they provided with us. The 3 people I talked about represent 3 types of Cuban currently working in the tourism industry. Maria appreciates what the revolutionaries did for the good of the Cuban people as a whole, and is still an enthusiast towards Fidel and Che. Duviel represents a younger generation who, through talking to tourists and other young people, crave a more updated lifestyle and better access to information. Rolando is a man who also appreciates the actions of the revolutionaries, but is now taking advantage of the non-communist opportunities the tourism industry is providing Cubans. It's difficult to say if all Cubans are happy or not with their current quality of life, but there's no mistake, they are all proud to call themselves Cuban.
My personal preconceptions of Cuba were strongly tied to the cultural views of the United States. After all, the two countries seem diametrically opposed. The US is capitalist and democratic, while Cuba is communist and totalitarian. The biggest difference was the way Cuba has treated its citizens, depriving them of such rights as freedom of speech and political expression, whereas the United States has always held the position of the inherent value of individual, unalienable rights. It would seem that the two countries would have to possess fundamentally contrary values in order to function so differently. However, throughout my experiences in Cuba, I began to realize that the two countries had more in common than we would like to think. As I learned more about Cuba, I began to examine the United States more closely as well. I slowly realized that the US and Cuba held surprisingly similar values, but had very different interpretations of what those values meant and how they should be expressed. The United States holds freedom and equality as two of its most core values. So how can Cuba, a communist country with a history of unjust treatment of its citizens, hold those same values at its core? In my presentation, I will try to examine the similarities and differences in values between the US and Cuba. However, I can only offer a very general picture since the relationship is far more complex than I can describe within the time I have. Let's begin by examining the idea of freedom. It seems like a self-evident concept that requires little clarification. However, the Merriam-Webster dictionary actually has quite a list of definitions, but let's examine one in particular. The absence of necessity, coercion, or constraint in choice or action. This seems straightforward, but I would like to point out that there are two parts to this definition: freedom from necessity and coercion, and freedom to choose or take action. This may seem like an arbitrary distinction, but it is precisely the difference between Cuba and the United States. The Cuban government provides its citizens with food, housing, education, and health care, freeing the Cuban people from necessity. They possess a freedom from many of the basic worries that confront the citizens of the United States. However, they also possess a freedom from coercion. Students aren't pressured into getting college degrees and are free from worries about studying something that will help them land a high-paying job, because, after all, they don't need to worry about basic necessities, and virtually all jobs have similar wages. So does Cuba value freedom? Absolutely. It is simply a form that is foreign to us. We see the authoritarian government and a lack of political expression because we gauge freedom in terms of action. For us, we believe in freedom of choice. Our liberties generally tell us what we can and can't do. We don't possess the kind of freedom from necessity that the people of Cuba enjoy, but they lack much of the freedom of action that we possess. However, that isn't to say that there is no freedom of expression or political activism. Here is a Cuban protesting the United States' unjust imprisonment of the 5 heroes. The 5 were imprisoned on charges of espionage and conspiracy against the US. However, the Cuban government claims that these men were attempting to stop terrorist actions against Cuba originating from within the United States. Displays calling for the release of the 5 are quite common throughout Cuba, and they give a good example of just how complex the issue of freedom is in both countries. Cuba is known for its strict laws and incarceration of political dissidents. However, the US government imprisons suspected terrorists in order to secure the safety of our own country in a similar manner. The other value that the US and Cuba both hold is equality. I think the distinction between the two countries is much clearer on this subject. Cuba believes in an equality of imposed sameness, whereas the United States believes in an equality of opportunity. Everybody has the chance to succeed or fail on their own merits. Due to Cuba's system, it avoids much of the problems that are currently facing the United States, such as the debate about the top 1%. In Cuba, everyone has essentially the same salary, around $20 a month. They get the same food from the government, and there is virtually no brand selection. Cuba is undoubtedly more equal than the United States in regards to distribution of wealth. However, there is far less wealth in the country to be distributed, which is the reason why many border on poverty. Despite having food and housing provided by the government, the average Cuban would have to save up for about a month in order to buy a single towel. Cuba lacks the economic opportunities that the United States equality of possibility provides. Here, everyone is capable of trying to better their lot in life through hard work and economic ventures. In Cuba's imposed equality, there is virtually no opportunity for growth. The only way to make more money is to get into the tourist business, which is heavily taxed and regulated. So although Cuba avoids the problems of extreme accumulation and stratification of wealth, it is incredibly difficult for a Cuban citizen to try and gain money in order to prove their lifestyle. The problem I think much of the United States has with Cuba is the sacrifice of the individual. What I mean by this is that Cuba believes that it is permissible to remove an individual's civil liberties, such as freedom of his speech and expression, in order to defend the revolution. We saw propaganda like this all over Cuba, extolling the virtues of the revolution and calling for personal sacrifice in order to support it. This here says we must begin to produce more. In order to have more, we must begin to produce more. And then here we have a quote from Che saying, one of the more noble ways to serve the fatherland is to devote yourself to work. We saw propaganda like this all over Cuba, extolling the virtues of the revolution and calling for personal sacrifice in order to support it. In fact, just about every surface you would normally see used for commercial advertisement in the US are used for government propaganda in Cuba, as you have seen, calling for collective responsibility and devotion to the country. Cuba takes away the rights of individuals in order to protect the greater good. In order to protect their interpretation of freedom and equality, the Cuban government often imposes draconian measures that require individual sacrifice, which seem repugnant in the face of values held by the United States. However, is the United States that different? Does the freedom and equality of the US prevent such sacrifice that Cuba's interpretation of freedom and equality engenders? It seems that the United States does the same thing due to a different interpretation of greater good. Our brand of freedom and equality are based on action and choice. People are free to choose how they act, and everyone has equal opportunity in order to try and realize their desires. However, this means that the onus to succeed is almost entirely upon the individual. Therefore, their lifestyle, be it of excess or poverty, is one that they earned. To put this in perspective, the United States has 18.6 million vacant homes and 3.5 million homeless individuals. Some basic math tells us that there are approximately 5 empty houses for every 1 homeless person. Why don't we simply give these people the available homes and solve the homeless problem? Because as a culture that supports capitalism, such action runs counter to our beliefs. So although the United States provides all of the civil liberties that Cuba does not, we still sacrifice the individual for the greater good of the system. Although I have described both countries so far in a general sense, it is important to point out that this is somewhat of an oversimplification on both sides, and that Cuba in particular is in a state of change. Cuba has been incorporating more capitalism into its economic policies, as well as expanding individual liberties. As Andrea mentioned, Rolando told us that communism is dead, but the socialist ideals still persist. Because of this, we can see that the Cuban interpretation of what freedom and equality mean are slowly changing. They have, in some sense, been learning from us, our value systems, and our global success. However, I don't believe that this should be a one-way process. We have a lot we can learn from Cuba, and we shouldn't let cultural bias prevent us from trying to reach a mutually beneficial understanding.
Now, Cuba may seem like a big, scary place way out there in the Caribbean to some of you, and in some ways it is. But it isn't as far away from home as you might expect. In fact, there are many comparisons that can be drawn between both Cuba and Juneau. Both Cuba and Juneau are, in one way or another, isolated. They also rely heavily on tourism and can be viewed as an exotic other. Cuba, being an island with very limited trade, really is its own isolated community. Sure, some of Cuba's farmed goods, such as coffee and sugar, do get exported, but it is hard for things to get into Cuba. In fact, just as we may have a black market associated with Cuban cigars, they too have one. The Cuban black market, or bolsa negra as they call it, is bustling with consumer goods that are tough or expensive to find in stores. People, often overseas relatives of Cubans, bring goods into Cuba via airplane. These goods then get distributed to family members or are sold in markets held in alleyways and old shops throughout Cuba. One reason that trade is so limited is because of the US-Cuba embargo. Many of the Cubans we talked to thought the embargo should be lifted. The US embargo, enacted as official policy in 1962, shortly after Cuba nationalized the property of American citizens, has meant near total isolation from global trade goods, from not just the United States, but from countries doing business with the United States. Many Cubans don't understand the embargo, finding it hard to get unbiased information that fully answers their questions. However, it is clear that the embargo is the reason that Cubans wear black market clothes taken from sweatshops in Miami. And they actually prefer these bright and shiny garments to those made in Cuba, which are often of poorer quality. And I think it's worth noting that all of the student speakers here are wearing some kind of Cuban garment. Cuba's people are isolated too. It is very hard for Cubans to actually leave the island. They may only vacate if they marry a non-Cuban or if they are extremely well-to-do in their government. Now, just last week, this policy shifted, but it was still in place when we were in Cuba, where we heard many stories like the one from a man I met in Las Terrazas, Yanqui, tales of far-off aunts in Venezuela and the possibility of escaping the island. But for almost all of them, it doesn't happen. And here's a picture of Annie in Las Terrazas. Now, our isolation here in Juneau obviously isn't as severe as that of the Cubans. However, being surrounded by mountains and water is very similar to living on an island. It can be hard and cumbersome to get things and people out of Juneau. Although Cubans aren't able to leave the island, other people are able to enter it. Communism, erupting in 1959, essentially ended tourism. At that time, Fidel Castro's Cuban government focused on providing basic necessities to its people. Cubans no longer had to pay for healthcare, housing, or even education, and they still don't. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, however, the Cuban government has made a conscious decision to support their socialist principles with the profits made from foreign travelers. This boom in incoming traffic has made Cuba a hotspot for eco, heritage, and the possibility of mass tourism. Watching firsthand the effects of tourism in Cuba gave me flashbacks to Juneau in the summer. Locals promoting the most authentic parts of their livelihood, and tourists and travelers alike catching a glimpse of a different culture. There are little reminders of life before the embargo scattered throughout Cuba. When we arrived, one couldn't help but notice the 1950s-style cars roaming the streets. Many of these cars have been stripped of AC units, window levers, and even door handles. These relics have been relegated to scour the streets as taxis, or retro remembrances of the past. While the cars all get fresh coats of paint on a regular basis, the rest of Cuba's infrastructure has been suffering in the past 20 years. Most notably, the buildings are in ill repair. In fact, one of my classmates had a building crumble into pieces just a few feet in front of her. The maintenance of these decaying cement buildings somewhat fell to the wayside due to Cuba's lack of monetary support. Antique fairs are also prevalent in large cities. They offer tourists a chance to reclaim a part of Cuba before the revolution. Cuba's rich history has made it an important destination for heritage tourists interested in its culture. Cuba can also be viewed as an exotic, or the exotic other it was in the 50s, a place where rich Americans could find leisure in such acts as gambling and prostitution. The power of tourism is evident by just how much money people working in the tourism industry make, as Andrea and Dominic have already stated. From one ride, taxi drivers can earn as much money as a nurse earns in a month. It is clear where money is to be had by Cubans, and it is in taxi drivers, casa owners, and restaurant owners. The main streets in large cities like Havana are teeming with Cuban merchandise. Seeing the ashtrays and Che shirts in Cuba reminded me of the gold pans and polar bear shirts of Juno. Tourism is integral to our community, much like tourism is to the Cubans. In Cuba, there are two types of people you'll come across: the jineteros, or people who will beg or swindle you for money, and the Cubano Real, which translates to real Cuban. It took some getting used to, but once we were able to pick out the people in a crowd who were trying to scam us, the real Cuba appeared. A Cuba where you could ask anyone on the street for a direction, and they would go out of their way to help you. Of course, if you asked 2 Cubans, you'd probably get 3 different directions, but that's just Cuba for you. Saying that I only learned during the Cuba immersion trip would be a gross understatement. I grew. I grew from the seed of a student who had never internationally traveled into a deeply rooted redwood, or Sitka spruce. I grew into a better student, traveler, and man. On this trip, I was forced to confront the demon of the unknown. Going to a place that many Americans have mixed emotions about was the easy part. Actually confronting the language of Spanish, the poorness of a country, the dead cats on the sidewalk, forced me to think on my feet. The 4 classes taught in Cuba, Spanish, ecotourism, Hemingway Lit, and anthropology, are all subjects I would have had trouble learning in school. In Cuba, however, all these classes had context. I was able to not only read Spanish in a textbook, but hear Spanish spoken on the streets, read Spanish in newspaper headlines, and converse in Spanish with new friends. I was able to see firsthand the effects of tourism on a community so reliant on it, and I could see connections to my own community. I read Hemingway on the very island where he spent a third of his life, and visiting the houses, bars, and beaches he wrote about created great context. There were hundreds of different cultural values and anthropological ideas that filled my head in this place with such a profound history. Learning about class subjects was only a fraction of what I garnered from this trip. This trip has made me respect traveling, not only for the knowledge it can bring to someone, but for the courage it can draw out of someone. Cuba has been such a chance to grow. So yes, as a student, I learned about Spanish, ecotourism, Hemingway, and communism. As a person, I learned about respect, networking, trustworthiness, and humanity. I found it just as easy to learn from my teachers as I did from the man on the street selling peanuts. I learned that history will always have a profound effect on the present, just as the present will have repercussions in the future. The information gained from this trip will always be with me, stored in my digestive tract, the knots in my brain, the scars on my head. Cuba has shaped me permanently, and for that, I am forever grateful.
Okay, so we have plenty of time here for question and answer, but again, I'll remind you that wait until the microphone, because this is going to be filmed. Maybe.
In Cuba in January, I guess about a month before you, and I was struck by, I just kept thinking about the change that's going to happen when the embargo lifted. And so my question to anyone, did this work? Hello? Hello? Oh, okay, just, all right. My question is, do you think, like, if President Obama gets reelected, do you think the embargo is going to be lifted? And have you any thoughts on what's going to happen to this country with no McDonald's and other signs? And will the people that have a leg up right now, the Casa Particulars, are they going to be poised to, jump into the mega hotels or whatever the industry, and what's going to happen to the others?
I'll try to answer that as best as I can. I had a conversation with one of the casa owners. It was in Moron, and Annie and I were staying together, and we were having dinner, and their son came up and served us, and we wanted to stop him and actually talk to him about the embargo, and he had very, very strong feelings about the embargo, and he wanted it lifted. And that's how most people I came across wanted it. They want this restriction to be taken off. And I think because it'll bring them more business too. That's what they're relying on. And I think that we even saw it every time that we came back to Rolando's place, there was lots of people being employed. Every time we came, you could see that us staying there or other people staying there was affecting them positively. And so although I think lifting the embargo, you'll bring in a lot of people and a lot of other things possibly into the country, it's going to also be a very positive thing. So there's negatives and positives to everything. And personally, I've only heard from Obama that he wants to lift the restriction, but unfortunately, of course, it is a campaign season, and the Miami population is so vocal, and it has been in a lot of elections, and so it's kind of fallen to the wayside. Hopefully, I look for, every time we've heard a debate, I've been looking for something with that. And I've heard other things from Romney and Newt Gingrich about how they don't want to lift the embargo, but I also hear a lot of other things throughout the whole campaign season as well, so that could change. But I guess we'll just see. So.
I was just going to say that in reference to what you were asking about the leg up, that I think is hard to answer. Although what I do feel like I saw a lot of was these Casa Particulares that, were receiving income directly next door to a house that had a thatched roof or holes in it. So I can't really answer the question of whether or not that will change, but at the moment it appears that there's unfortunately a really, unevenly distributed amount of wealth coming in through tourism. So if the embargo is lifted, my hope would be that that would provide more opportunity for the vast majority of the people, but again, I can't really say. That was all I had to add.
Yeah, I was there also 9 years ago, and we've got one of the students here who was on the trip. And there's been a lot of changes since that time. One of the things that's going on is oftentimes we're very US-centric, but there's actually been a lot of European investment in Cuba. And if you get on the north coast there's resorts and other things where Europeans, the Brits now are traveling there a lot. So that kind of gives you an example of how some of the investment will just continue to go. But the US, yeah, there's many different groups that are poised for and waiting for U.S. investments. There's U.S. investors kind of poised, waiting to move in there. So that touches on that a little bit. But you still have, on the individual basis, I think the students have kind of answered the question very well. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so my question actually is mostly about Dominic's presentation, and it seemed like you were attributing most of the kind of low standard of living to the communist system there, and I'm just wondering if you guys think that would be really different if there had never been a U.S. embargo, or if it had been lifted a long time ago. Is the standard of living a problem with the communist system, or is it a problem with being totally isolated and having an economy that's constantly being undermined by the U.S.?
Yeah, I'd say that the system works to some degree. There's just not enough resources in the system to bring everybody up to sort of the level that they want to be at. And the embargo has certainly played a role in sort of keeping everybody down in the impoverished level. Yeah, I mean, any influx of wealth kind of is fairly evenly distributed. As Miles noted, though, that the tourist economy is where you get the big differences. And so if there hadn't been an embargo, they might not have had to rely solely on tourism in order to bring money into the country.
Also, I think with the embargo in place, just a lot of information. Cubans are just now having access to more information. And so now we were seeing a lot more of a want from people in wanting a different life, where before they were pretty content with living in, with everybody being equal. But now, I mean, if the embargo is lifted, that would definitely affect the way people are viewing the way that they're living in their own country, because they would see more of what's outside of their country, and they would probably be demanding just more in general.
Did you get a sense for how Cubans feel about Cubans who have left and moved to the United States?
Yeah, sorry, my name is Miles. What I felt like was generally no, hard feelings towards individuals who'd moved to the United States. It seemed that there was a lot of family members, and so naturally there was this, longing to see them, or infrequent contact over the phone, or a visit maybe. But am I correct that the question was just kind of, I guess, people's thoughts towards, or Cubans' thoughts towards other Cubans who had, left the country, in terms of like maybe jealousy or anything, or just in general?
Well, in general, but also the fact that it's the Miami Cuban community that has been so powerful in keeping the embargo in place. It seems like there's some mixed feelings that you would find, and I was just wondering what you found when you were there.
No, that's interesting. I'm aware that the Miami, basically Little Havana, is kind of the inhibiting factor with the embargo kind of being eradicated. So I never actually had any specific, conversation with anyone about I guess, Miami Cubans, but in terms of, the individuals that I spoke with that had family members or knew people abroad, there wasn't really any hard feelings, but that definitely seems to be kind of a big factor, though.
also there's a lot of remittances that come into the country because of family members in Miami. So that is actually one of the biggest sources of income coming into the country through remittances. And so, yeah, we've got a mixture of people who have family in Miami and that they feel towards them, they want to see them, they're getting money sent into them. And there's also the very well-off Cubans in Miami that are very vocal. So there is kind of a mix, but for the most part, I just saw people that wanted to see their family, pretty much what Miles said. Just wanted to add that part about remittances. It's so important to Cubans that have family abroad.
So it's the government, I'm assuming, that keeps this political system in place, and you mentioned that everyone receives an equivalent of about $20 a month. Does that income also apply to top government officials? And if not, does that affect anybody's view of the system and if they're being felt taken advantage of?
I'll be quick. Just to put it in perspective, in the stores we went to, it was about $12 for a towel, and they get $20 a month. So really, there is such a low social class in Cuba, and we didn't meet with many government officials. I believe one of the last days we did talk to the consulate, yeah, and they grilled us. But other than that, we weren't able to ask them questions in a very easy manner, and I have a feeling they would lie to us.
So I'm Alex Botello, and I guess what's interesting about that kind of response and that question is that whenever we talk to anyone in Cuba, we ask them about what they feel about America and the American government and that relationship with Cuba. They'd always told us that the embargo and any kind of hard feelings, that was a relationship between governments. It's not how the Cuban people felt about Americans. We felt that they were, we're all people. That was kind of the response that we had. Also, what's interesting about Cuba is that everyone votes there, and it's not a requirement. You're not required to vote, but yet I think somewhere in the 90 percentile of people voting in elections. So it's, if I think that's right, anyway. So yeah, I think it's kind of whether they want to be paid $20 an hour, they probably don't, but again, they're voting for this process, so it's not imposed on them.
Yeah, there was quite a large population of black people that live in Cuba. I wondered if you saw any interactions or witnessed any discrimination against black people. How do they deal with different races there?
Well, my big project for graduating was looking at social perspectives on race, gender, and sexual orientation. So that's why I talked a little bit about a couple of those things. And race is, the majority of people there are actually Afro-Cuban. It was a slave country. And there is still, they say that everyone is equal legally, but socially it's different. And you can tell that on the streets. We were talking to some Cuban families, and I asked them about race, and they said, no, everyone is equal. But if my daughter were to date a black person, I would ask, well, why are you dating that person? Couldn't you date someone who's of Spanish descent? And they said that, if they prove themselves to be a good person, that they would be fine with it. But that question always comes up. And so you can tell that there are tensions between certain groups. For the most part, I kind of felt that the younger generations were a little bit more accepting of changes in social attitudes towards race and gender and sexual orientation, and that the older generations were a little bit more traditional. But the big difference, and my main thesis was that there's a difference between what is legally equal and what is socially equal. And when you talk to Cubans about equality, you have to really dig deep to see what kind of definition they're using, whether they are talking about their legal system or if they are actually talking about themselves and how they think.
I kind of had a two-part question. The first part is, you were talking about the differences in not necessarily income, but wealth. Did you see, aside from the houses and the condition of the buildings, any other forms of that separation? And the second part is, if the embargo is lifted, do you think that there will be an even greater separation of wealth, the 99 to the 1%? Is that a possibility or even a probability?
I think one of the biggest separations in wealth that is in Cuba right now is the tourism industry that really, really separates who has the money. So yeah, we saw the differences in the houses. We saw differences in clothing, who was receiving more clothing from Miami and who was wearing clothing that was years and years and years old. I believe that if the embargo was lifted, we would see a greater wealth disparity. In Cuba, there's already people fighting against this communist system and finding ways to get around the label of communism and making that extra buck on the street by taking tourists from point A to point B, or teaching you a salsa class, or helping you out in some other way to just, earn a few more pesos. So I think that if the embargo was lifted and there was kind of more of this overbearing demon of capitalism in Cuba, that there would definitely be a greater wealth disparity, because people are already trying to get ahead of their 20 pesos per month, or $20 per month. And if they didn't have that communism imposed on them, there would be an even greater push for more wealth and more wealth and more wealth, as we've seen it happen in the United States.
I mean, I don't know about speculation really with things like embargoes, but the facts, Cuba has a dual economy with two currencies, and it's inherently unequal, and they are building a cruise ship dock in Havana. I mean, tourism is this agent of really dynamic, active change. It's transforming Cuban society. So the embargo will probably be lifted, but the bigger factors involved would say, Emily's exactly right. The disparities in wealth will continue to grow, and so it was a really interesting time to be there based on that.
Before we get to the next question, I just want to thank the student presenters and Kevin. Just incredible. Thank you so much. But also I want to let you know that there is a UAS in Cuba blog where you can read entries from many of the other students you were not able to hear from tonight, and there's many, many more pictures. So if you want to take a look at that blog, you can go to the UAS website, uas.alaska.edu. We have a press release about this presentation, and there is a link to the blog. There's also one through the Empire website on their arts edition, Thursday edition article about this presentation. And before we get to the next question, can we just pass the microphone? And can each of you introduce yourselves?
I'm Annie Thomas. I'm
Dominic again.
Lars Johnson.
Ellie Sika.
Andrea Budbill.
Serena Draskowski.
I'm Miles Gayton.
I'm Emily King.
Alex Botello.
Megan Nye.
Forrest Wagner. Dan Monteith.
And we're missing one professor, Claudia Wakefield, and two students, Olivia Pitasha and Gloria Lumba.
Yeah, I had a follow-up to the
racial equality question, and it really is the gender equality question. If women are considered equal to men there, in their jobs, in their behavior, in their attitudes, and I'd be curious if that's reflected in the 9 proposals for marriage. How many of them were male Cubans and how many were female?
So this isn't going to completely answer the question, but we had, actually Ellie and I stayed in the same family in Cienfuegos, which is one of the bigger cities, and we had a conversation with our casa owner about this exactly, and because a lot of the girls, every girl on this trip, almost every person on this trip, I think, was, drew a lot of attention when you were walking down the street. And we were whistled at, we were just catcalled, basically. And we asked him about that. And he said that that's totally normal, that guys do that to all girls, Cuban girls, whoever, and that the girls do it too. But we didn't really see it that much with the girls. And you could tell just by watching people that somebody who's white gets a lot more attention than somebody who's not, because they can assume almost that you're not from Cuba, and they know you're a tourist, and they might want to marry you. They really might want to marry you to get out of the country. Like it's serious. And anyway, but he was telling us that it's totally equal, that women do the same thing. That's how they meet guys, but we didn't totally see that.
Yeah, to add on to what Andrea was talking about, women are objectified a lot in Cuba, and I think it was an interesting cultural shock for all of us, because we did talk to people and they were like, well, if a girl's pretty and she's walking down the street in short shorts, like, of course you're gonna tell her she looks fine. Like, why wouldn't you do that? And so that happened all the time, and so that was a really big culture shock, but you didn't really see that women weren't getting the roles or the professions that they wanted because of the gender separation that we saw, women police officers and women in the government and women working all kinds of professions, and you could possibly attribute that to communism because it really puts everyone on an equal playing field as far as professions go. Yeah. Like women to women?
Just to add, though, these women who were professionals or cops, they were also wearing miniskirts and fishnets. So it's not to say that just men do this to women. The women are also continuing this with their fashion or the attention that they want to seek. And so that I think that also gets put onto us as tourists, because we come with our own set of connotations that people think about us when we go there, or our intentions for why we're traveling to Cuba. So we would go out salsa dancing and we would want to see how it's done, but then the men would take this as we were trying to find Cuban boyfriends, or the girls were thinking that our guys were after Cuban women as well. I don't really know, I can't speak for you, but that was kind of how it seemed. And also, I was told by a Cuban guy that I shouldn't wear lipstick because that meant that girls were looking for boyfriends. So that's just an example.
So to that question as well, yeah, I didn't get any marriage proposals, but I did get one-night proposals, and that was particularly awkward. There's no judgment here, but what was interesting is some of the occupations, although there was no official, gender-specific roles. I did a study on the kind of tobacco industry, and all the women that were in the, all the employees of some of the factories, they were all women. They were the ones that picked out the stems from the tobacco leaf. And also the people that were kind of the administrators and records keepers, they were also all women. But the people that were moving the tobacco in 100-pound bags, they were all men. I don't know. I'm sure if a woman wanted to do that, they could, or if a man wanted to be the stem picker, they could. There was no separation in salary, but that was just sort of something interesting that I saw.
It's on. Excellent. A quick question. Two questions, actually. The first one, did the women smoke cigars? Yes, nodding. Okay, cool. The next was, if the embargo is lifted now that the doors are swinging at least wider open, is the government in Cuba strong enough to prevent a descent into chaos, a loss of legitimacy, and probably a transition into some other system, be it however neat or chaotic?
Well, so I can answer the first one, which was the women smoking cigars. You did see them smoke cigars. But what was interesting was that we kind of have this idea that, you know, in Cuba, all you do is smoke cigars. But if from a financial point and from a Cuban perspective, it's a lot more economical to smoke cigarettes, because when you buy a cigar, it costs you, you know, for them 5 cents, but a pack of cigarettes is like the equivalent size, but you get, you know, 10 of them. So why smoke a cigar? So you mostly saw older men smoking cigars, but the occasional old women on the street smoking something that was this long was pretty common. I guess for the second question, it's kind of hard to say exactly what's going to happen, but my impression from being in Cuba is that even right now, the tourist industry, which is kind of like the main model of capitalism in Cuba right now, is pretty heavily regulated by the government. And I think that they're going to try to pride themselves in making sure that if you know, the floodgates of capitalism come into Cuba, that I think they're going to try really hard to still kind of stay true to the socialist idea in taxing and trying to make regulations in place so that it doesn't go out of control and there isn't a Starbucks at every corner. I don't know that, but that's my interpretation and what I would like to see.
And one quick anecdotal example of just how regulated it is. I met a former English professor who was working as a security guard. His dream was to become a tour guide, and in order to do that, he had to pass a test in 2 other languages besides Spanish. And so he had left his profession as an English professor and had been working to become a tour guide for multiple years in order to get actually legally registered. And so it's a pretty intense process.
Rather than forecasting or trying to look into our crystal balls, I'll leave that up to my economist colleagues, but as an anthropologist, I like to look at change. And one of the things that I saw in the past 9 years in Cuba has been change from kind of a Cuban socialistic system, which wasn't too different than what I saw in the Eastern Bloc or in Russia after it broke up. And that was people who were part of the Communist Party had different sorts of privileges. And so the distinctions in the haves and have-nots, there really weren't too many have-nots, but if you had a little bit, if you were closer to the party and an important player there, you did have some privileges. And the old cliche, membership has its privileges. In the socialistic system, that was very true. As it moves more into this capitalistic kind of syncretic system of mixing capitalism with Cuban socialism, you know, now, as Alex said very well, you know, there's a lot of government control of industry. And, you know, you have a lot of companies that are, of course, owned by the government. You also have the outside European companies that are moving in, China, and others that are very interested in that area. So who knows where it will go, but I think as the students were saying, there's going to be a great deal of disparity and differences between people. And a lot of that's going to be the connections to the tourism, as all the students have pointed out.
My question is about the sustainability, your sense of what the sustainability of the system is, and if with the recent move to have exit visas, do you get a sense that there would be a lot of migration out of this, to get a visa but never come back? Or is there enough pride in being a Cuban to stay there, to stay put, even if you could get off? And do you think that if things loosen up, that the Miami Cubans or people from there will go back to the island? I know that's a lot of questions, but it's basically with this kind of freeing up now, does that make a difference in the in-migration and out-migration?
So one of the interactions that I had when I was in Cuba was this man, his name was Ariel. He was from Trinidad, one of the first places that we visited. And he was a really interesting guy. He was probably in his late 20s. He was a wrestler and on the national team for a while. And he had visited the United States on one of his trips. I think he said he went to Montana or Michigan. I don't really remember, but he was an athlete, but for whatever reason came back to Cuba and didn't win, but was, again, very strong man. Regardless, he told me that there's a lot of pride in being Cuban, but at the same time, he showed me a Cuba that was, I guess, of a lower quality of life. We went through some of the less tourist locations of Trinidad, and there wasn't running water. They had to pump it out from the water systems with hoses. It was interesting to see. It was kind of eye-opening, and he said, again, this is what he said. I don't know if it's true or not, but what he told me is that if Cubans had the opportunity to leave, there would be no one left on the island. But if they had money and made a good living, they would all come back. So I think that kind of illustrates what their impressions are.
With the exit visas, the first thing is they need money to travel. And they get $20 a month from their job. So even if they were given the availability to leave the country, it's the issue of gathering and saving enough money to actually buy a plane ticket and then to buy a hotel room or, just get started going somewhere, even just to travel, not even just to leave. So I think that is a main thing that's also holding people back, but it's also unclear as to what this getting rid of this exit visa means. There's a lot of things going around about how normal Cubans can go travel now. And then there's also things about how doctors and athletes can't leave now. There's just a lot of different things going back and forth. And so it's very unclear. It keeps everyone a little confused, even the Cubans. The articles that I've read myself, there's some Cubans that are pretty confused. But I did read one where this guy was like, well, I somehow got enough money. I have a plane ticket. And so we'll see in January if I can leave or not. So only time will tell, I think.
I have a two-parter. After 8 weeks in a totally internet-deprived country, first question, did you have withdrawal? Was it upsetting not to have Facebook and smartphones? And the second part is, can you tease out any behaviors in the social interaction of the Cuban society that you notice was different from ours because they do not have all this technological connection?
So, first off, I didn't have withdrawals, but I think that's because I got doses of Facebook and email contact when we were in Havana mainly, but also they have what's called Utexa, I think. Utexa, and it's basically where you can purchase a phone card or an internet card, and they generally would have one computer. So there was intermittent contact, with home. Remind me again your second question. It was the social interactions without having the internet. Was that correct? Okay. The phone, tended to be used quite frequently. And then I also noticed that, you know, there was a much more centralized community, it felt like, in a lot of these areas. Havana is a huge city, so broken down within neighborhoods, there was a lot of this kind of centralized social relations, you know, between, say, a 4-block radius. But in the smaller towns, you know, in Vinales in specific, when I think Alex and I, and maybe, you know, a few other people, we'd been walking around and we're like, oh yeah, we're staying at Jorge Sara's house, you know. And they're like, oh yeah, Jorge and Sara, yeah, we know exactly where they live. And we were, you know, in the middle of a field up near the base of these magotes, these, you know, rock faces that we were walking around. And so I think that, you know, not having the internet as readily accessible hasn't really been something that they're consciously aware of. That, I mean, they've made it as far as they have, and they've, you know, gone about their daily lives without it for so long that it's not really something that they, you know, necessarily think about as frequently.
Yeah. I think the example I would cite of something that changed a social relation that was different because there was no internet is baseball, right? We went to 2 professional baseball games. Cuban baseball is really, really famous, but it wasn't what I expected, right? There was no program. There was no announcer telling us who was at bat. There was no apparatus, right? There was no halftime show equivalent, right? But everybody, yeah, the scoreboard didn't even work for the first half of the game, right? Like we couldn't, you had to really be paying attention. But everybody knew all the players' names. And they knew it because for a long time, right, the only legal place to socially gather in all of Havana is Parque Central. And every day you could walk by there and there were a group of 20 to 50 to 80 young men talking about baseball, right? If you want to do that now, you log on to ESPN and you play your fantasy team or whatever, right? Like you don't have that kind of ongoing dialogue, and that to me is totally fascinating, right? Like there's a cultural moment that we just don't have replicated anymore, you know, and I miss that, I guess. So, and I might suggest we take one more question. I see lots of people getting antsy, but Andrea wanted to add to that.
I'll be quick. So one thing, I found it pretty refreshing not to be connected all the time to internet. But I think one example or another example of ways that people communicate differently is through the Casa Particulares and through the systems, because we found places to stay through the people we were staying with before. So, for example, the first couple nights we were at Rolando's in Havana, he had friends in Trinidad. So he called them up, booked us some rooms there. They called their other friends in Trinidad because there were so many of us. And that's basically how we found places to stay every single day or whenever we were leaving to go somewhere. And that was all through phones. And they had a list that we had at one point, but usually we would have to talk to them. They would call their friends. They would call their other friends. And that's how we got everywhere. Now, I mean, here in the United States, if you need somewhere to stay, you go on whatever, hotels.com or something like that. And we tried, but it didn't really work. We just definitely relied on the people that we stayed with.
Is there or do you have any perceptions of the health of the coastal waters? And are there local fishing economies, large or small, and or sport fishing tourism? I know, thinking back on Hemingway, he was doing that, but I wondered if they make a living off the water.
Yes, right. I can speak to the sport fishing, partly because I was interested in going sport fishing there, and it's very heavily regulated. You can't just go sport fishing. You have to hire the Italian company that has been basically given all the rights to sport fishing, at least on the North Coast. I think Dan might be able to speak more to the coastal ecology and the actual practices of fishermen. We did see a lot of people with hand lines along the Malecón, you know, supplementing their kind of rations quite frequently. And we did see small fishing boats that, to me, looked very much like the boats in The Old Man and the Sea. But the sport fishing is very heavily regulated. It's actually more expensive to go bone fishing there than it is in all of Mexico. And it's only recently been developed within the last decade or so. So it's kind of this place that everybody wants to go now, and they realize that, and they've been able to turn a pretty hefty profit on it.
In terms of the health of the coastlines of Cuba, one of the interesting things compared to just about any of the other Caribbean island countries, because of that kind of Soviet or Cuban socialist kind of idea of management of space and public lands, with the exception of maybe Havana and Santiago, a lot of the places, they don't build up the waterfronts. You know, you don't have big resorts, or you can think of any big places, even in Mexico or other places, where a lot of the development is right there on the beaches. And you don't have that because there's this sense of leaving the beaches free for everyone. And even the way they build in the cities is the old Soviet way of these kind of concrete bunker apartment buildings, as I call them, with these kind of squares where the people can interact and have recreation. But there's a lot of projects on the northern coast where they've tried to develop causeways out to the different islands. And at this point, they're trying to assess what the damage has been, because in connecting those different islands out to the areas that we were going to see that are in Hemingway's stories and novels, there may have been an impact, you know, because they're restricting the flow. They're doing a lot of research, but they don't have a lot of money to put into that research. So I think at some point there'll be opportunities for collaborative research, either between European universities or maybe someday US universities. So it's kind of a double answer there in terms of there hasn't been as much development. The sorts of development have been these kind of mega old Soviet projects just before the Soviet Union divested from Cuba, that there are these major causeways, and I think those have had some significant impact on the northern coastal island areas there. Yeah, in terms of fishing, I've been a commercial fisherman for 30 years now in Alaska, and I always like talking to the fishermen there. During the Soviet era, well, the Soviet interaction and kind of Cuban socialism, the heroes are the agricultural workers. I see it, the factory workers. And they're almost, to me, seems a little bit of a stigma against the fishermen, in a sense, commercial fishermen, that I kind of sensed, and I've heard other anthropologists talk about that, you know, who are revered in kind of Cuban socialism, the factory workers, the agricultural workers, and to a lesser extent, the fishermen. Commercial fishing, big in terms of connection with tourism.
Again, we could keep having this conversation for the entire night, but I wanted to thank everybody for coming out. I know there were a lot of choices tonight, and I would really urge you to come see Ernestine Hayes next Friday night. I saw that lecture this summer. It's powerful. It's worth your time making the drive out to campus. So if you're at all available, do come see Ernestine Hayes next week, and thanks again for coming.